Joining the Immortals Part 2. 8 or 9 years had passed away when suddenly Cheng reappeared, clad in a yellow cap and stole, and wearing the expression of a Taoist priest. Zhou was delighted, and seized his arm, saying, "Where have you been, letting me search for you all over the place?" "The solitary cloud and the wild crane," replied Cheng, laughing, "have no fixed place of abode. Since we last met my equanimity has happily been restored." Zhou then ordered wine, and they chatted together on what had taken place in the interval. He also tried to persuade Cheng to detach himself from the Taoist persuasion, but the latter only smiled and answered nothing. "It is absurd," argued Zhou. "Why cast aside your wife and child as oh you would an old pair of shoes?" "Not so," answered Cheng, "a man may wish to cast aside his son, but how can he do so?" Zhou asked where he lived, to which he replied, "In the great pure mansion on Mount Lao." They then retired to sleep on the same bed, and by and by Zhou dreamt that Cheng was lying on his chest so that he could not breathe. In a fright he asked him what he was doing, but got no answer, and then he waked up with a start. Calling to Cheng and receiving no reply, he sat up and stretched out his hand to touch him. The latter, however, had vanished, he knew not whither. When he got calm, he found he was lying at Cheng's end of the bed, which rather startled him. "I was not tipsy last night," reflected he, "how could I have got over here?" He next called his servants, and when they came and struck a light, lo! He was Cheng. Now Zhou had had a beard, so he put up his hand to feel for it, but found only a few straggling hairs. He then seized a mirror to look at himself, and cried out in alarm, "If this is Mr. Cheng, where on earth am I?" By this time he was wide awake, and knew that Cheng had employed magic to induce him to retire from the world. He was on the point of entering the ladies' apartments, but his brother, not recognizing who he was, stopped him, and would not let him go in, and as he himself was unable to prove his own identity, he ordered his horse that he might go in search of Cheng. After some days' journey he arrived at Mount Lao, and, as his horse went along at a good rate, the servant could not keep up with him. By and by he rested a while under a tree, and saw a great number of Taoist priests going backwards and forwards, and among them was one who stared fixedly at him. So he inquired of him where he should find Cheng, whereat the priest laughed and said, "I know the name. He is probably in the great pure mansion." When he had given this answer he went on his way, Zhou following him with his eyes about a stone's throw, until he saw him speak with some one else, and, after saying a few words, proceed onwards as before. The person whom he had spoken with came on to where Zhou was, and turned out to be a fellow townsman of his. He was much surprised at meeting Zhou, and said, "I haven't seen you for some years. They told me you had gone to Mount Lao to be a Taoist priest. How is it you are still amusing yourself among mortals?" Zhou told him who he really was, upon which the other replied, "Why, I thought the gentleman I just met was you. He has only just left me, and can't have got very far." "Is it possible," cried Zhou, "that I didn't know my own face?" Just then the servant came up, and away they went full speed, but could not discover the object of their search. All around them was a vast desert, and they were at a loss whether to go on or to return. But Zhou reflected that he had no longer any home to receive him, and determined to carry out his design to the bitter end, but as the road was dangerous for riding, he gave his horse to the servant, and bade him go back. On he went cautiously by himself, until he spied a boy sitting by the wayside alone. He hurried up to him and asked the boy to direct him where he could find Mr. Cheng. I am one of his disciples," replied the lad, and, shouldering Chu's bundle, started off to shew the way. They journeyed on together, taking their food by the light of the stars, and sleeping in the open air, until, after many miles of road, they arrived in 3 days at their destination. But this great pure locality was not like that generally spoken of in the world. Though as late as the middle of the 10th moon, there was a great profusion of flowers along the road, quite unlike the beginning of winter. The lad went in and announced the arrival of a stranger, whereupon Mr. Cheng came out, and Joe recognized his own features. Cheng grasped his hand and led him inside, where he prepared wine and food, and they began to converse together. Joe noticed many birds of strange plumage, so tame that they were not afraid of him, and these from time to time would alight on the table and sing with voices like panpipes. He was very much astonished at all this, but a love of mundane pleasures had eaten into his soul, and he had no intention of stopping. On the ground were 2 rush mats, upon which Cheng invited his friend to sit down with him. Then, about midnight, a serene calm stole over him, and while he was dozing off for a moment, he seemed to change places with Cheng. Suspecting what had happened, he put his hand up to his chin, and found it covered with a beard as before. At dawn he was anxious to return home, but Cheng pressed him to stay. And when 3 days had gone by, Cheng said to him, "I pray you take a little rest now, tomorrow I will set you on your way." Joe had barely closed his eyelids before he heard Cheng call out, "Everything is ready for starting." So he got up and followed him along a road other than that by which he had come. And in a very short time he saw his home in the distance. In spite of Chu's entreaties, Cheng would not accompany him so far, but made Joe go, waiting himself by the roadside. So the latter went alone, and, when he reached his house, knocked at the door. Receiving no answer, he determined to get over the wall, when he found that his body was as light as a leaf, and with one spring he was over. In the same manner he passed several inner walls, until he reached the ladies' apartments, where he saw by the still burning lamp that the inmates had not yet retired for the night. Hearing people talking within, he licked a hole in the paper window and peeped through, and saw his wife sitting drinking with a most disreputable-looking fellow. Bursting with rage, his first impulse was to surprise them in the act, but, seeing there were 2 against 1, he stole away and let himself out by the entrance gate, hurrying off to Cheng, to whom he related what he had seen, and finally begged his assistance. Cheng willingly went along with him, and when they reached the room, Joe seized a big stone and hammered loudly at the door. All was then confusion inside, so Joe hammered again, upon which the door was barricaded more strongly than before. Here Cheng came forward with his sword, and burst the door open with a crash. Joe rushed in, and the man inside rushed out, but Cheng was there, and with his sword cut his arm right off. Joe rudely seized his wife, and asked what it all meant, to which she replied that the man was a friend who sometimes came to take a cup of wine with them. Thereupon Joe borrowed Cheng's sword and cut off her head, hanging up the trunk on a tree in the courtyard. He then went back with Cheng. By and by he awaked and found himself on the bed, at which he was somewhat disturbed, and said, "I have had a strangely confused dream, which has given me a fright." "My brother," replied Cheng, smiling, "you look upon dreams as realities, you mistake realities for dreams." Joe asked what he meant by these words, and then Cheng shewed him his sword besmeared with blood. Joe was terrified, and sought to destroy himself, but all at once it occurred to him that Cheng might be deceiving him again. Cheng divined his suspicions, and made haste at once to see him home. In a little while they Arrived at the village gate, and then Cheng said, "Was it not here that, sword in hand, I awaited you that night? I cannot look upon the unclean spot. I pray you go on, and let me stay here. If you do not return by the afternoon, I will depart alone." Zhou then approached his house, which he found all shut up as if no one was living there, so he went into his brother's